Hey guys, our topic today, like my memories of 2020, is all about low lights. More specifically, the low light performance of the Sony ZV-E10. We're going to be looking at that as well as comparing it to its older brother with apparently the same sensor, the A6400. In my detailed ZV-E10 review, I said the new camera seemed to have slightly better low light performance than the A6400. Was that accurate, or was I talking more crap than a fertilizer sales call specialist? So I've put together a few tests to look at ISO noise, autofocus performance and image quality in low light situations, and I'll also give you my overall conclusions around what kind of ISO levels are going to work best for different shooting situations, plus of course which camera I think is the best overall performer in low light. And if you enjoyed today's video, then like, subscribe and let me know any questions or thoughts down in the comments. Let's begin. First up, let's be clear what we're using for these tests. In low light, you will want to use the widest aperture lenses you can for the best level of performance. So right now you're looking at the Sigma 30mm f1.4, currently on the ZV-E10, and the Sigma 16mm f1.4, currently on the A6400. Both cameras have white balance locked at 5500K, shutter locked at 1/50, and they are both using the HLG3 picture profile with identical settings. So any differences you see will be due to underlying camera performance rather than settings. So with that said, like Anthrax and Public Enemy in the late 1980s, let's bring the noise. ISO noise in this case. The first point here is that the amount of light in your scene generally and on your subject in particular can make a big difference. You're seeing some examples now of identical settings in basically pitch black environments compared to the same location with some ambient light from a smartphone screen. Even a relatively small amount of light can significantly impact how noticeable and problematic ISO noise is. With zero or very limited amounts of light, you won't get decent noise performance beyond around ISO 4000. Even then, that might be a bit high for some situations. Generally, the less light you have, the more grainy and problematic noise is at each ISO level. With more light on your subject, I'd say up to ISO 8000 can be usable from a noise perspective in many situations, maybe even up to as high as 16,000 on the odd occasion. There are also some important considerations around image detail and the impact of motion, which we should be considering alongside ISO noise as we move to higher ISOs, but we will cover those in a second. And just to be clear, the maximum ISO in video of 32,000 is unusable in every situation that I've tried. While noise at ISO 8000 or even as high as ISO 16,000 can be manageable or sometimes add a grainy look which some people might like, the amount and movement of noise at ISO 32,000 looks more unsalvageable than my career as an anti-tattoo activist. This could be a problem. At the opposite end of the spectrum, if you can get enough exposure while staying below around ISO 3200, ideally staying as low as ISO 1000 or 2000, then you should have minimal concerns around image noise. Now, image noise is one area where I really can't tell any difference between the A6400 and the ZV-E10, and both are a nice performance upgrade over something like the ZV-1. But what about those other image quality areas that I mentioned earlier? Well, here there are some surprising differences. One area I did not expect to be talking about in this video is color. Now, when I do the full detailed comparison of the ZV-E10 against the A6400, we'll talk about color science, but for low light there is a specific thing I found which is worth discussing. Our low light testing revealed a weird color shift that happens when you push ISO higher. I got some examples of that color shift with both cameras. For the most part, the ZV-E10 keeps colors pretty close to what my eyes were seeing in reality, and I only got one really prominent example of shift, whereas the A6400 seems to very consistently suffer from color change when pushing to higher ISOs. The ZV-E10, on the odd occasions when it does have color issues, seems to go with some kind of magenta shift, which incidentally does sound like the name of a weird progressive metal song. By contrast, the A6400 is probably more of an electronic music fan. Based on that matrix-like color shift, it seems to experience every time you push to higher ISO levels. When you do get color shift, it generally starts being noticeable around ISO 8000 and gets worse and worse as you push higher. So if you can stay below that level, you shouldn't be seeing too much color strangeness. Speaking of strangeness brings us to another aspect of image quality: motion. Like many spam emails, we will talk about softness problems later, but first we have some weird image trailing issues to cover. I'm showing some examples on screen to help illustrate, but essentially both cameras have an issue with moderate or fast motion when in low light, where a trail or a visual echo is left briefly behind the motion, almost like a cloud of color noise. And like noise, this issue definitely gets more prominent and problematic as ISO is pushed higher and as light in your shot is reduced, with an increasingly noticeable trail of color that almost looks like a video effect. This ghost trail, which incidentally would be a great name if I owned a Halloween-themed restaurant, is unfortunately not the kind of video effect that you can turn off or dial back in post-production. So if you're shooting with a very high ISO or with very low light, then try to avoid significant motion in your shots unless you want more ghosting than my past dating experiences. The image trailing problem looks the same to me on both cameras, so I think it's an issue with the age of that APS-C sensor they both have in common and its readout speed, similar to how that sensor readout speed causes the rolling shutter issues I've mentioned in my other ZV-E10 videos. I wanted to be sure this is indeed a low light and high ISO specific problem and nothing to do with motion blur, so I tried the same test in good light at the same 1/50 shutter speed. And while there is still some of that rolling shutter style jelly, there isn't any image trailing when you're shooting with good light. So you've got to watch out for noise, image trails and color shift. But what about actual detail and definition? For this test, I've turned to my one true mentor in life for help, Mr. Homer J. Simpson. I've zoomed in on him very heavily and varied my shutter speed so that we can keep a constant exposure as we increase ISO. You'll see the same pattern on both cameras as we push ISO higher, with a gradual softening and loss of detail. The lined paper behind Homer and the left edge of the mug are good spots to see how we are starting to lose both extra detail and line definition. The loss of detail and increased blurring is almost a visual parallel for Homer's duff drinking experience, poetic in its way. You'll see ISO 1000 is pretty defined even with our heavy zoom. 2000 softens slightly, but it's around 4000 when things get more noticeable, and from 8000 onwards our background lines start blurring away and the straight lines of the mug itself become quite frayed. These rough milestones are also borne out in our test footage. Up to ISO 3200, I'd say you can get decent detail if you don't have too much motion, but beyond there you'll see more and more noticeable softening. Now that might be okay in some settings. The softness can look nice and cinematic if it works for a particular shot, and once again, more light on your subject can help you retain more detail. But as a general rule, I would recommend trying to keep ISO as low as possible and definitely below the 3200 to 4000 area to preserve maximum possible detail. Of course, detail and definition rely on things being in focus, which brings us to our last important area: autofocus performance in low light. And while some of our tests have seen similar performance between the A6400 and the ZV-E10, here there are big differences. When it comes to low light autofocus, the ZV-E10 destroys the A6400 based on my testing and experience. Autofocus works more reliably overall and works at lower ISOs when there is limited light, as you can see from the examples being shown here. That is true when you're using the same lens or with different lenses. On that note, it's worth saying that the Sigma 16mm, which I've already reviewed, seems to perform better with low light autofocus than the Sigma 30mm, which I will be reviewing soon. Similarly, touch tracking rack focus worked more reliably and at lower ISOs on the ZV-E10 than on the A6400. And crucially, in our real world examples, the ZV-E10 did a much better and more reliable job at getting and maintaining focus. The examples you're seeing now are around ISO 6400 and ISO 8000, with both cameras correctly exposed. Yet, despite those same settings and conditions, the A6400 would frequently lose me. And while the ZV-E10 can certainly still lose focus in low light, it is much rarer, And in fixed position shots like the ones that we've seen, once it has focus, it does a great job holding on to it compared to the A6400. Autofocus for vlogging is more challenging for both cameras because the lighting conditions will change as you move, but I still found that I could trust the ZV-E10 more. Plus, the lack of image stabilization means a gimbal is basically required for low light vlogging with the A6400, since I don't think there are any really wide aperture lenses which have in-lens stabilization. By contrast, the active steady shot of the ZV-E10, despite its flaws, gives you more of an option for spur-of-the-moment vlogging in low light if you don't have a gimbal with you. Plus, that stabilization means handheld, low-light B-roll shots are actually doable with the ZV-E10 in a way they just aren't on the A6400. Pretty nice, but now I have a question. And that question, like an existential crisis or watching a Christopher Nolan movie, is what the hell does all of this mean? Thankfully, our answer is a bit more straightforward here. There is some really decent noise performance at higher ISOs, but some problematic color trails if your shots have too much motion. Plus, image quality might get too soft and mushy for some shots or work nicely for others as you push ISO levels up. Another common rule for both of these cameras, and indeed all cameras in general, is that lower ISO and more light will drive better results. But things diverge when we talk about color and autofocus. The weird color shift on the A6400 makes higher ISOs even less usable, but crucially, the autofocus and stabilization differences mean the ZV-E10 is just more reliable, more versatile, and more capable in low light. But what do you think? And how do those strengths and weaknesses work for your use case? Let me know down in the comments. And since we've reached the end of today's video, if you enjoyed it, then like, subscribe, and check out the affiliate links to support the channel. But most importantly, until next time, take it easy.